Hello, everyone. I'm the Director for Common Knowledge Trust, and for the past 6 days, we've been doing a free COVID-19 live birth skills online class. Common Knowledge Trust started in 1996 when I immigrated to New Zealand, and I brought all of the skills that hundreds of mothers and fathers developed in the early 1970s, and I carried in my head for 25 years before I put it into a not-for-profit, and then spent time creating resources so that we could pass on the skills to all of you who are pregnant. And today we're going to talk about progression of labor. I want to make something very clear at the beginning of this. When Birthing Better Skills developed in the early 1970s, there was a very high societal expectation in the United States that all expectant parents attend the very first childbirth preparation classes, and those were skills-based. When anything starts that's new, you always have to expect there should be an evolution of that to refine and improve, because then you get feedback. Sadly, back then, the goal of those skills-based methods, Lamaze and Bradley, focused entirely on women who were low risk having a normal pregnancy with the assumption they'd have a normal birth. And that was a wrong message. We had to refine the message. And the message is simple, really. 100% of pregnant women will give birth one way or another. And as long as we're conscious, we should use skills. Now, why should we use skills to birth our baby, since it's a physiological thing that happens to us? Well, because we use words like happen to us, right? Or giving birth. But the reality is, for any of us who have done that, we know it's an activity. We do it. It's an activity. And a large part of that activity is that we want to cope and manage, which are very strong verbs. We want to handle. We want to work through. We want to deal with. We want to stay on top of. And goodness, we want to feel in control. No birthing woman likes to feel out of control. So we need to understand that as humans, we need to rethink this. We need to rethink birth, and we need to realize we need to elevate it to the possibility and the probability of it being a skilled activity that we learn skills for. And the good news is that we are all one humanity, and 100% of pregnant women will give birth, and it is an activity one way or another. Now, the natural birth movement has said for years, giving birth is about having a labor and a vaginal birth, with the assumption or the implication that only women can do to each other when we're gnarly to each other, is that having a cesarean isn't really a birth. We're not really birthing our baby. And this is not accurate. Every single pregnant woman, it is normal and natural to end pregnancy by giving birth, having a baby, doing the activity of giving a birth. And Birthing Better families knew that from the start, because we get pregnant to have our baby, and our baby is important to us. It doesn't have to be important to anyone else. It's our baby. It's our birth. We are ending our pregnancy to become a mother or father by birthing our baby. And each of us wants to feel empowered by that gateway experience. And so Birthing Better families, when we developed these skills in the early 70s, was clear. Having skills is for all birth, not just for a type of birth or a philosophy about birth or anything. It's just about birth. So these classes this week have been about the skills that all Birthing Better families have used. We've prepared our body, whether we're going to have a non-laboring cesarean or labor and end up with either an unplanned cesarean or an emergency one, or a vaginal birth. We do it because we want to have a rich experience being pregnant. We prepare our body because it gives us pleasure to do it. It brings us closer to the people who are going to be involved in the baby's life after the birth. It makes us feel more connected to our baby and to feel that we have a relationship to this child that as soon as we got pregnant took over our lives, and we felt out of control from the moment we got pregnant. So we need to understand that for us to change, we must have an idea, and that idea is that 100% of pregnant women are going to give birth. And we have to have a language, which is 100% of pregnant women are going to do the activity of birthing their baby, and we should all have skills to do that. And then we have to have actions. And those actions are, we have to have skills-based methods, and we have to be saying it's normal and natural when you're pregnant to self-learn birth and birth coaching skills and use those skills when you birth your baby. And that's how we change childbirth for the better, because now we just have an oppositional approach. We have midwives versus obstetricians, home versus hospital, medical versus natural. And what we do as women is we're mean to each other. And not only that, but we're mean to our children. So when we have a language like, I had a home birth, you had a cesarean, I trusted, you read everything and ended up with interventions. Or when we say about our children, he was my cesarean, she was my home birth. We have to stop this. We have to stop it. Every pregnant woman is going to birth her baby, and her baby's important to her. And all of us can use skills to birth our baby. So today we're going to focus on progression of labor. Even though there is now a 30 to 40% cesarean rate, and I've talked early on in the other classes how we got there. We didn't get there because the medical profession was running around with knives in its hands. We got there, and I lived through this, so I know we got to where we are because we as consumers demanded, as modern people, to avoid risks. And so we demanded that the medical profession around maternity care reduce the risks. And the way they know how to reduce the risks is through assessments, monitoring, and procedures. And so you need to understand that if we want to have less assessments, monitoring, and procedures, then we have to become more highly skilled. And fortunately, in the 60s and 70s in the United States, we saw what that means because my generation were highly skilled. Multiple millions of mothers and fathers went into birth in the 60s and the 70s, at least with the beginning skills of Lamaze and Bradley. And we impressed every single labor and delivery nurse and every single obstetrician. Sadly, there was a confused message because Lamaze and Bradley were advocated as connected to natural birth, pain-free labor, and no medical assessments, monitoring procedures. So the labor and delivery nurses and the obstetricians were saying skills don't work to achieve those goals. They were right. If the focus had been that skills should be about reducing suffering and permit women to cope and manage and for families to work together better, it was a whopping success, massive success, because my generation of people who had babies felt empowered, even though the skills needed to be improved. So we want a skills-based evolution of childbirth now, because the idea got pushed aside when the next group of natural birth advocates dismissed skills. Cows and cats aren't taught to birth. Women don't need to be taught. And said women just need to have the choices to say no to medical care. They didn't develop a choice-based trend that we're in now to say yes to more medical care. They wanted women to say no to medical care. And they have a list, and that list, when I teach birth professionals, 28 things. So as women to each other, we are saying in order to have that ideal natural birth, you must avoid 28 things, which range from inductions to having your membranes broken or swept, or having vaginal exams done, or fetal monitoring, or not being able to get up and walk around, not being able to eat, or having an episiotomy or a forceps or a cesarean. It's like, oh my God, we can't do this. Birth is natural because it follows pregnancy. So even with the high cesarean rate now, many of those cesareans, the women start laboring. Now, what did Birthing Better families learn? So we've talked about, we first focused on and not to suffer. We didn't want to suffer. So we developed very sophisticated skills about breathing, communication, and touch, and other softer skills like teamwork, staying in the now, the negative and positive voice. Then we started to see this increase in cesareans because, why? Consumers demanded them. Why? Because we didn't want to have a scar in our belly from a classical cesarean because we were wearing bikinis. So we wanted them to hide the scar. So they came up with a bikini cut. We wanted to have vaginal births after those classical cesareans. That wasn't as safe as it could be. So the medical profession responded with a bikini cut, which made it safer for us to have a vaginal birth after a cesarean. We didn't want to be knocked out during a cesarean. We wanted our partners with us. So they came up with spinals and epidurals so that we could be awake, having a safer cesarean, and having the potential to have a vaginal birth after a cesarean. We didn't want our breeches or our twins to die. There are lots of reasons that there were risks in pregnancies and that we wanted to prevent. And so the cesarean rate rose according to that, along with the fact that skills got removed from the conversation. And instead of seeing 8 out of 10 pregnant women use skills, the medical profession started to see less than 1 out of 20. And then the suffering came back, and the medical profession responded by not wanting women to suffer or have long labors and the babies being tired. So the cesarean rate has increased because we have demanded it. And if we want to change that, then we need to grow a skilled birthing population. And it's just as simple as that. It's not hard to learn skills to birth your baby. And we're going to talk about progression of labor, because what we discovered with when we didn't suffer, when we coped better, when we managed better, we still often had a long first and second stage. And that's what drove Birthing Better families in the 80s to develop all the body skills that we talked about in the second class and that are in the courses that Birthing Better sells. So we needed to create more space in our body because dads got this. Fathers and mothers equally developed the skills. We all blink, we all cough, and we can all tighten up our rectum, which meant we could share a set of skills together. We all breathe in the 4 patterns: in the nose, out the nose, in the nose, out the mouth, in the mouth, out the nose, and in and out the mouth. All of those 4 patterns have variations that all of us as humans do. We can all tighten up in the same way. We can all create space in the same way, which means that we can share a common body language, which is very, very good news. And that means that fathers or whoever's coaching us can see and hear whether we are coping and managing well. And we can read contractions to understand what our baby is saying to us about labor. We can create space and mobility. Remember in one of the earlier classes I talked about what's a stuck baby. And a stuck baby is when you can't slide your index finger over your thumb. What's an unstuck baby? It's when you soften. You didn't move anything. You didn't even see anything, but now I can do that. You can do that. Tighten up. That's tighten your rectum. That's what it is. Do a pelvic floor exercise. That's tight. Your baby can't get through that. It's harder. It has to open us up. So this is tight. What's an unstuck baby? Just soften. Don't move anything. Just soften. There you go. So soften inside now. That makes space for your baby. And this is what fathers got. That's why fathers are so instrumental in developing all the body skills. They got it. It's an exercise in plumbing. Big object has to come out of a container. The container has to open up. It has to be soft. It has to be mobile. Give me some skills and I can help do that. So we talked about that in the second lesson in this quick COVID-19 quick birth skills class, free classes. And you'll find them on our playlist on our YouTube. So today I want to talk about progression of labor, because when we developed the skills and we had these long labors, we had to understand, what is a progressive labor like? What is a stalled labor like? And they were simple. A progressive labor was one in which the contractions got longer, closer together, and more intense within an hour or two. This has nothing to do with whether a cervix dilates 1 centimeter an hour. What we learned as we developed these skills is that 30% of us have this progressive labor. Our contractions get longer, stronger, and closer together every hour or two, but we don't dilate. And when we do dilate, we dilate very, very quickly towards the end of birth. So it's not a question of whether our cervix is dilating, it's a question of whether there is change in the quality of the contractions. And anybody who has had a progressive labor knows that they are having one. Anyone who has had a stalled labor knows they are having one. It's how we speak about it. The women who have progressive labors talk about change. Wow, it's more intense now. Oh, they're closer together now. Oh, the contractions are longer. Oh, they're harder to cope with now. That's what women say when we're having progressive labors. And when women aren't having progressive labors, what they say is, I feel I've been doing this forever. Oh, the contractions seem so spaced out. They seem so short, right? So we need to know that we are talking about what we're doing and what's happening to us. Nobody wants to be in labor for hours and hours and hours and hours. So when I gave birth in 1970 and there was a 4.5% cesarean rate, it meant the rest of us, the 95%, labored. That meant we could labor for hours or days. It meant that our babies could move through easily or were stuck for hours or days. It meant that the risks that we carried with us could eventuate or not eventuate. It meant that we could suffer or not suffer. So you need to understand that when we just all labor, everything that could happen might happen. So Birthing Better families wanted to prevent, if possible, or reduce the possibility of labor stalling. So we had to figure out how to do that. And part of it was preparing our body to create space. Because the more we created space for the baby, the more we saw these progressive labors. So how did we end up understanding, besides what women were saying, which women will often say when they have a progressive labor, is, I didn't waste one contraction. Well, that's good, right? But it had to do with what is happening in a contraction. And we talked about it in the breathing, about the 5 phases of contractions. What women were often saying was, the beginning of labor, the contractions weren't painful. I just went about my business. Then the contractions got a little bit more painful. And what women started to say was, well, I can feel them, but they're okay. They're not particularly painful, but I'm really aware they're there. Then they got a little bit more intense. And women would start to say, oh, they're beginning to be a bit more painful, but I can cope with this. Then they got more intense, and women would say, it was really challenging for me to cope with this, but I could. Then they got more intense, and women started to say, I'm losing it. Then they got more intense, and women would go, I just lost the plot. Now, that's a woman who lacks skills, because as labor is progressing, she doesn't have the skills to cope and manage and stay on top of the sensations that she has. So when she is saying, I can feel them, but they're not really doing anything, what we learned because we did the internal work, we could check ourselves for change, was that that is a phase where the uterus is still effacing the top part of our vagina or the lower part of our uterus, and it's still effacing our cervix. When the contractions start to feel a little bit more, it's the same thing. There's some change. That change is instead of a softness in the top of our vagina that's beginning to thin out, it's beginning to smooth out. When we begin to feel the contractions and are aware of them, then sometimes we're beginning to dilate a little bit, and you can't often feel the cervix. It's quite far back. When we can really start to feel them, when they begin to be, 3 minutes apart and a minute long, if we go in and check, we can sometimes find the cervix and we can find an arc to it, and that would be considered to be the beginning part of active labor. When the contractions then become really quite intense, if we go in and check again, we may be 4 or 5 centimeters dilated. When they get really almost unbearable, then we check. We're maybe 6 to 7. We don't have to know it's 6 to 7. We can just feel that change. How do I do this? Okay, so if we can put almost 2 fingers in there. That's 2 centimeters, 3 centimeters, 5 centimeters. You just feel the arc. Okay, you just feel the arc when you're checking yourself. And when it gets really, really, really intense and we really, really almost can't cope and it's really, really overbearing, we're almost fully dilated or we're dilating. And then we start to hear our breathing change to that. And that's the full dilation. The cervix is behind the pubic bone. It's retracted into the hips. It's retracted all the way back to the sacrum. And we can never feel back there. We can only feel the front. And then we begin to push. And if we've prepared our vagina, then the baby moves down our vagina fairly rapidly because that soft tissue opens up. It's not tight. It's not constricted. The baby isn't trying to then stretch that tissue. And most of us have not seen this. Most of us don't see births, but you can tell. Women talk about it. I only had a few contractions. That meant the vagina opened up easily. I pushed for hours. That meant the vagina didn't open up easily. It was tight. Or because when I gave birth, we all lay on our back with our feet up in stirrups, to which everybody goes, "Oh, see the medical profession." So the natural birth movement said we shouldn't be on our back. Good plan. But then they put us in a semi-recumbent position, which sits on the sacrum. And the sacrum is the bone. The baby needs to move back in order to turn the corner to start to come down through the vagina. So when the natural birth movement starts saying things, it doesn't mean that what they're saying helps us. It just means they don't like that. And so they put something else in place, right? So when we're lying on our back, and how do you know? Lie on your back with feet up in stirrups. It's not a gravity position, but you're open. For goodness sakes, you feel massively open. Now, sit back on your sacrum with your knees up. You block the sacrum. Your baby needs to push that back to come around the pubic bone. And that's why women are lifting all the time or coming off to one side. And then they tighten up the muscles, which constrict the sacrum. And this stops us from having a progression in our birth. And there's all sorts of reasons why we don't progress in the birth. And we want to try to help you understand that today. So we go back to the premise of progression of labor is when labor contractions get longer, stronger, closer together every hour or two. And a non-progressive labor is when they don't, when it's spread out. It's longer. You seem to be doing the same labor for hours and hours and hours and hours. What we learned is that this is the message the baby is giving us. When we are having a progressive labor, the baby's a big object, doesn't have to be thinking, doesn't have to be writing this down. It's a big object that is telling us organically within our body, "Hey, Mom, you do not have tension inside that I'm struggling to open up. You are not bending my space so that I have trouble navigating down through you, and you are not compressing my space to make it harder for me to come down through and out. Okay, so when we have a progressive labor, the space the baby needs is not compressed. Where does it get compressed? Well, we just talked about it when you're sitting on the sacrum. When women have back labor, the natural birth movement said counter pressure on the sacrum. Sounds great, but what are you doing to the space the baby needs? You're compressing that space. And that's why women will say, I had terrible back labor. My husband pressed on my sacrum for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours. That's why Birthing Better families develop things like the sacral maneuver or Kate's cat or the sit bone spread or the hip lift to create space to work with your baby rather than against it. And because most people who are birth workers are not body workers. They've taken anatomy and physiology. That has nothing to do with a big object moving down through a body. So what's bent? Well, some babies are very, very sensitive to the posture of the upper part of our body. So you can have a woman in labor who's sitting on a ball, for instance, and balls aren't necessarily good or bad. They're just a thing, okay? And she's sitting quite upright, and her labors are progressive, which means that the contractions are getting longer, stronger, and closer together every hour or two. She becomes fatigued, and she leans forward, and suddenly the contractions are more spaced out. But because she doesn't know that's the message her baby's giving her, and because she's being told to change positions frequently, and she's being shown pictures of women leaning forward in a chair, she's assuming that that is a good position. But it's only a good position if her baby is continuing to give her the message through each contraction that this is a good position. Now, what does a contraction, what's a progression of labor contraction actually feel like or look like? Because that's important. They start, all contractions start, we know that. A progressive labor then goes up in intensity. It rises in intensity, and it has a peak. It has a defined peak, and then it begins to go down, and then it goes away. So it's a bit of a bell-shaped curve, although for some women, the rise is very quick, the peak is quick, and then it goes down a little bit more smoothly. Other women, it goes up a little bit less smoothly. So that bell-shaped curve can be slid over one way or another. What's a non-progressive labor like? Simple. It starts, they all start, it begins to go up, and then it has a plateau, and then it goes away. And every woman who has a contraction that is progressive knows she's having one. And every woman who's having a plateaued contraction knows she's having one. She doesn't know what this means because we don't have a skilled birthing population. And so women assume that a peaked contraction is normal, and they assume a plateaued contraction is normal. They are both normal, and they're both natural, except one is a progressive one, and one is indicating that that woman's baby is telling her, you either have tension in your body I'm trying to work through, or you are bending your body or in a way that I can't navigate down through and out, or you're compressing my space. So Birthing Better Families sorted all of this out. So learning to read contractions was important for birth coaches, particularly women and birth coaches, mothers and fathers who work together then and share a common set of skills, work very effectively as a team. So when a woman is having a plateaued contraction, the birth coach may hear that faster than she does. And when we talk about positions in labor, we need to understand that the positions that you see on that chart are not necessarily effective positions for you and your baby. And this is important to understand because we live in a body, and our baby is a body getting through a body, which means the space in our body and the relative size of our baby's body is important. The baby is going to slightly change its body because it can mold its head. Babies who mold its head are telling you retrospectively that you had a lot of tension inside your body, because if it has to change shape to get through the container, it's telling you that that container is tight, and so it has to try to mold through it. We can create space, and when you go back to the second lesson in this about the body stuff, we did the hip lift, we did the sacral maneuver so that you can learn how to create space. And we've talked about the internal work, about working with all of the soft tissue and the muscles inside all of the soft tissue of your vagina, how important that is. So when we are in a position, so I'm sitting down now, I'm in a position. You are sitting, lying, standing, you're in a position. First of all, how open do you feel in that position? So I can feel my sit bones now, and I can move them apart to create more space. And you're always remembering this analogy. This is stuck, can't move, soften, move. So any little bit of space that you can create is big space. It's not little space. It means something to that baby trying to get out of you. So if I'm sitting down and I can create more space, my body, the upper part of my body, is in a relationship to the lower part of my body. So if I'm sitting here now and I'm having a contraction, and that contraction starts and it starts to go up and it has a defined peak and it comes down and it goes away, my baby is telling me that the position I am in now, the way that my upper part of my body is in relationship to the bottom part of my body, is fine, not a problem. So if I then decide that I'm going to lean forward like that, then what I'm doing is I'm changing the posture of my position. I'm changing the relationship of the upper part of my body to the lower part of my body. This is not a positional change, it's a postural change. So when the upper part of my body changes in relationship to the lower part of my body, my baby is partly in the upper part of my body still, because I'm still pregnant. And if it is moving through my pelvis, it is also partly in the lower part of my body, which means that if I bend that space and the contraction starts, as they all do, and then it begins to go up, which they all do, but it plateaus off, which I say to myself, that's not like the last contraction that had a defined peak, and then that one goes away. That my baby is telling me it does not like that I am bending forward. I don't care what those charts tell you to do. You need to learn to read your baby's birth messages, just like I needed to learn to read my baby's birth messages. And why we in Birthing Better, the families that develop these skills, we're so proud of ourselves to be able to do this, because we could then adjust our postures and our positions to help our baby move down through and out our body. None of us want to be in labor forever. So the more we do to work with our baby, the better it is. So we've talked now about bending. That can be sitting or standing or whatever, bending the upper part of our body relative to the lower part of our body. Now let's talk about other positions, because the positions on the chart, the natural birth movement was into we must be in a gravity position. But when we're, so when I'm sitting now, I am in a gravity position. Okay. When I bend forward, if the contractions go off, if they plateau, I'm still in a gravity position. That's not the point. Okay. When I'm lying on my back, I'm not in a gravity position. But some women are very open in that position and don't have any trouble. Their babies have no trouble coming out. In fact, I'm not a midwife, I'm not a childbirth educator, I'm not a doula, but I've been in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of births, okay? And I've heard thousands of birth stories. And some of the birth stories are absolutely bizarre. You have women who don't want to be birthing where they are now, and they're trying desperately to get to where they want to birth, and they feel the baby comes, and they put their chin to the floor and their butt up in the air, and the baby comes out anyway. Okay, so babies can come out in anti-gravity positions, right? They can come out in all sorts of positions because if their size relative to our space doesn't have any constriction, there's no compression, there's no bend, yeah, they don't care. They're just going to come out, right? So you need to understand that when we talk about positions, it's about your body, your baby, and nobody else's. So a lot of the natural birth movement said women should walk in labor. Well, sure, fine, but we're ignoring something. What happens to our human body? If you're sitting here now and you're listening to me, think about your hamstrings, the back of your upper leg. Think about your butt muscles. Think about the space between your sit bones. Think about them when you're sitting down. Okay, particularly if you've created space between your sit bones, like I did just a few minutes ago. Just think about that. Think about the tension down there. Think about it. Feel it. Now stand up. What happens? Okay, if you didn't get it, that's okay. Go back, sit down again. Now create space between your sit bones, assuming that you have a baby. Think about it, whether you're pregnant or not. Just think about it, because this is a skill you can pass on, right? Make as much space, because your baby needs as much space as possible between the sit bones. Think about it. Feel what your big bum muscles are doing. Feel what your hamstrings are doing. Now stand up. What happens? Okay. We tense up. We close up. All of us do. We all do. Because we're weight-bearing bipedal human beings, which means we're two-footed and we keep our body upright. And we keep it upright because of all of the connective tissue, all the stuff that holds us together, and our muscles. So when we walk, for many babies, they find it harder to come down through and out our body if their size relative to our body is snug, because we haven't learned the skills to relax and soften. So this doesn't mean you shouldn't walk. So when you're sitting down and you stand up and you feel that tension, intentionally relax. And where are you relaxing? To some degree, you're relaxing on the outside of your body, but also soften on the inside of your pelvis. Soften between those sit bones now. So you know that you've created mobility in your body. So now you've done that. Put one foot forward as though you were going to walk. Don't walk. Just put one foot forward. Feel how your muscles re-engage and how that bilaterality now changes that space. And your baby has to adjust to that. So now soften in there. Put your other foot forward. You get that contraction again, that resistance again. Soften. So you have to work with your baby, or else you're asking your baby to create space and to push you apart or to tear you apart or to stretch you apart. Not a good plan, right? So when Birthing Better families started to develop these skills, the natural birth movement was talking about walking, which is a great idea. And so a lot of women who ended up working with the Birthing Better and developing these skills had walked for hours and hours in labor and ended up with stalled labor. They didn't know why. They had done all the right things. The same way with positions, the leaning forward, the posture, the upper part of your body or lower part of your body that we talked about, the compression, the compression of your sacrum, or the sitting on back on your sacrum. Now, people will talk about, what about lying down? Well, sometimes we are required to lie down. There's nothing that we can do about it, in which case that's the reality. But lying down can be very open. We can put pillows between our legs. We don't have to lie flat on our back. Even with a fetal monitor, we can put pillows under our back, slightly turn on our side, put space between those sit bones. But we also have what we taught in other of the classes, the pelvic clock, softening on the inside of your pelvis to make space. So we can adjust if we are required to lie down. We can keep softening in our bum, soften in our hamstring, soften in the pelvic clock, create space in our sacrum if we know Kate's cat, or we can do the hip lift or the sacral maneuver to keep creating space. We can put the bed up a little bit so we're in a partially more gravity prone position. We can do all sorts of things. We are not strapped to the bed like my generation was, flat on our back, and we still, many of us, had very positive pushing contractions because our baby, relative to the size of the inside of our body, fit through fine. So when we're dealing with a progression of labor, we're listening to whether the contractions start, go up, peak, go down. If it's not progressive, it will start, go up, plateau, go down. We then have to think, is it our posture or our position? Are we compressing the space or are we bending the space? These are the things that have to go through our mind. And we have to be willing to make the changes. Are women willing to make the changes? No. We're often not willing to make the changes because we don't have the skills to cope with progressive labors. Because progressive labors, the contractions get longer, stronger, and closer together, which means that we experience more pain, which goes back to the beginning. I stopped being able to cope, and that's why growing a skilled birthing population has to focus on to prevent the suffering first, to get women coping, managing, dealing with, working through, handling, staying on top of, and feeling in control. That should be good enough for our humanity if we can possibly do that. Grow a skilled birthing population so that we all cope better and don't suffer. Good plan. So, women who don't cope well when the contractions are progressive do everything they can to avoid the progressive contractions, which are more painful. And so we instinctively get into positions that back off the labor. When natural birth movements say women should instinctively birth, my God, you'd think they'd never been at a birth before. Honestly, when women are having progressing labors and they do not cope, they do everything they can to decrease the pain. They instinctively react to pain like all humans instinctively react to pain. We try to avoid it or to stop it or to cut it down. So you see women who are upright having progressive labors bend forward, the labor backs off, it gives them space, they feel more relaxed, or they get into a hands and knees position. And in the video, we show you what babies do in different positions, right? So when we're in a hands and knees position, the baby drops down towards the floor, the head gets like this, it no longer flexes, so a larger dimension of the head has to try to come through us, which is more likely to stall the baby if it's in the pelvis. But because the head flexes and the body drops down, then you have a baby that's head here and the body's dropped down, which is doing that. And so it's in a very anti-gravity position. It's like lying on your belly, really, and the labor contractions back off. And the woman goes, I have more space, I can rest more. And a lot of care providers, birth professionals agree. They agree. They think this is a natural form of pain control. Oh my goodness, this is crazy stuff. So the woman then stays in a hands and knees position, sometimes for hours. So she hinders her own progression of labor because she lacks skills. She doesn't know how to read a baby's message through the contractions, and she gets in positions that back off the labor. And so she ends up in labor for hours longer, which ends up with perhaps more medical care because you're now in a longer first or second stage. And this is insane. When the 70s and the 80s, the hands and knees birthing position for second stage, everybody advocated that. Why did they advocate that? The baby's head is deflexed, a wider dimension. Women were tearing through their rectum because they were putting more pressure on the tissue between their vagina and rectum. This is insanity because people are not thinking body relationship of object to object. And this has to change, just has to change. And that's why after so many years of just backing off this conversation, I've decided during this COVID period, I've got to speak up. Because if we do not speak up for all of us to become skilled to birth our babies, then we are going to continue down the path we're continuing. Because if we have a choice-based system, women don't want to suffer. And so they will choose more medical pain relief. Of course, why not? If we don't have the skills to open up our body, to get our babies out of our body without damaging it, or damaging our baby, then women are going to choose more medical care to reduce the risks. So what happened when we became more skilled? How did birth professionals respond to us when we had more effective labors, when we coped better? They loved us. Oh my God, they just loved us. And that's what we saw in the 60s and the 70s in the United States when multiple millions of women were skilled. All of the assessments, monitoring procedures that we endured and didn't particularly like but accepted because to us, modern medicine was better than village birthing. All right, we just believed that the modern world, indoor plumbing was better, electricity was better, refrigeration was better, indoor heating was better. We all believed this was better. So is it right or wrong? Is it good or bad? Is modern life better? I don't know. All we know is that we accepted the assessments, monitoring procedures, and we accepted the medical pain relief because women suffered. And we knew that there were issues around childbirth. And so we demanded things like RhoGAM shots for Rh negative or to be tested for strep B, right? We demanded these things. So when in the 60s and the 70s, multiple millions of mothers and fathers had skills, many of the assessments, monitoring procedures we had just stopped. And we could now, your generation can get out and walk. We couldn't. You can eat and drink. We couldn't. You could have more people, not now with the COVID-19, but, you could sometimes take a shower. You could have a birthing. You could birth in the same room. You didn't have to have an episiotomy. You could be more upright. All of the things we created for you because we were skilled are now disappearing because the natural birth movement told you that skills weren't important. Cows and cats aren't taught, so you don't have to be. You just need to have choices and say no to medical care. Well, more women are saying yes to medical care and less of them are skilled. We need to change that. You have to change it. I can't change it. I'm 76. Anybody who sees this has to go out to every single friend and relative and say, it's normal and natural when you're pregnant that you learn birth and birth coaching skills and use them to birth your baby, no matter where you birth, no matter who is present, no matter your circumstances, your beliefs, your choices or lack of, and no matter what happens to or around you, because this is an activity only you are doing with your baby, and you'll do it better if you're skilled. It's so simple. My goodness, right? So we have to do that. Birth professionals love working with skilled women and skilled fathers. They feel more relaxed. They negotiate better when there are potential issues or risks that could become problems. Because when we cope better, they see us coping better. And when we cope better, we can talk to them more clearly. And they don't have to put suffering and risk into the same place. When fathers see women in pain and think, normally, gee, she's in pain. Look at her. My God, she's red. She's sweaty. She looks terrible. Help her. They think that pain is a problem. Well, pain isn't a problem usually in labor. It's the natural occurring pain of contractions of your uterus retracting back this very tight muscle called the cervix. So if fathers have skills, then they know that their job is to help you work through that pain and to cope better. And when they see you coping better as a man or another person with you, they're more relaxed. And trust me, the birth professionals are not only more relaxed, they're joyful because they're not as stressed. And when you have issues, and most of the Birthing Better families were very medically high risk, so when we were skilled and the risks were not eventuating into a problem, they negotiated with us. We just worked with and around the assessments, the monitoring procedures, because we chose to be in an environment where those things were happening, and we worked with and around them. We didn't always like them. We didn't have to like them, but we coped better. And we had the most amazing births. They were work. We worked for these amazing births, and we just worked. So when we are lack skills, the medical profession wants to come in and save us, and we ask them to do that. So it's your responsibility to the next generation that all of you become skilled to birth your baby, no matter where you birth, no matter what happens around you. It's really important to do it. Now, how long does it take to use Birthing Better resource? Well, we start at 24 weeks to prepare our body. It takes 5 to 15 minutes every day or two. Then you learn the birth skills along with it. So from 24 weeks onward, if you're 40 weeks, learn something. Just browse through the classes. Choose the ones you want. And if you're a birth coach, choose the skills you want. Learn different ones, then teach each other. The internal work started 32 weeks, 5 minutes a day. Now, we've had people for 50 years say to us, well, I don't have time, I'm really busy. And we go, are you going to be busy when you have your baby? And they go, no. Well, your baby's here now. My goodness, be skilled to birth your baby. You've got to be skilled to be a parent, so be a parent now. Your baby's here now. Be skilled. Put in 5 to 15 minutes a day for 16 weeks. You put in more time to learn to drive a car. So you need to just be willing to put in time to become skilled to do this one-off activity that happens so infrequently, that's so life-transforming, that we remember the rest of our lives. Wouldn't you rather be empowered by skillfully working through your baby's birth journey than to just have it happen to you and feel passive to it? Of course, but it doesn't come by magic. You can't rub skills on your body or say, yes, I've learned them. Now, thankfully, all the Birthing Better skills, well, I'm sitting here, I can soften inside my pelvis. Well, I'm sitting here, I can create space. When I'm sitting here, every time I breathe in, I can expand in my pelvis, and every time I breathe out, I can soften inside it. Whether I was a man or a woman, we can both do it. My goodness, this is not rocket science. We just have to have in our brain the idea that giving birth is an activity. That's the idea. And we have to put the words into that idea. So the idea is that birth is an activity. The words are that we should learn skills. The actions are we should use skills. And we should, if we're going to labor, we should use those skills to learn to read our baby's messages. That if we are having a contraction that starts, goes up, and peaks and goes away, we are not compressing the baby's space. We are not bending the space. We have enough space inside for the baby to move down through and out of us. Okay, so I am almost at the end of this. Look, we are a New Zealand NGO. If you go to commonknowledgetrust.org, there's a donation button. Please donate to us. I've spent 50 years of my life saying the same thing. I don't have any interest in childbirth. I am passionate about us being skilled for anything. I would have preferred to have taught you all to change a flat tire or to make a fire without a match. But the reason I carry this forward is that the hundreds and hundreds of fathers and mothers who developed these skills asked me to in the early 70s. And I thought, great idea, because at that point it looked almost like the skills-based methods of Lamaze and Bradley, that we could evolve them and that they would go hand in hand with the next evolution, which was that women should have choice, but they didn't, because the famous people, the natural birth advocates, dismissed skills because they focused on skills creating the natural birth, pain-free labor with no medical care. Those were narrow goals. They were narrow to the number of women who wanted those things or could achieve them, and they absolutely were the wrong goals, which were 100% of pregnant women are going to give birth. We should all be skilled no matter where or what that birth unfolds like, because we want to cope better. That should be the skills. So I gladly carried this forward and ran into a stone wall, and that stone wall still exists. And who can change it? You. I can't. You have to change it. People who listen to this video, you need to become skilled. Doesn't matter what system you use, but don't confuse information with skills. Information is about making choices and decisions. Skills are your behavior, how you act, how you cope, how you manage, how you work through the sensations you have and what happens to or around you. We have a wonderful ebook called Positive and Negative Voice. A lot of us do not like what they do to us. A lot of us don't like the sensations of labor. They hurt. That goes back to the beginning. I could cope, then I couldn't cope, then I didn't cope. We don't have to like it. We have to manage it. So thank you so much for listening to this. I'm going to continue tomorrow because I'm going to talk about the impact of your birth on yourself and your family and in your society. And we'll talk also about fathers and the role of men and why moving them from being birth coaches, which they were in the 60s and 70s, to being support people has been absolutely disastrous to the family. And we need to go back to having mothers and fathers, or whoever that other person is, to work together, and what the role of the doula and the midwife is. We need to talk about this tomorrow, and that will be the 7th free COVID-19 birth skills course. And thank you all for participating. Please share these links, tell other people, let this become a movement, because I'm an old person now, and if we don't have a movement, 50 years of my life will have been for naught. And that's just unacceptable, because look at what's happening. And what's happening is not a mean medical profession. It is us. We have to make the change. If we want to birth better, we need to birth with skills. See you later. Bye-bye.